may I request Professor Karla Hoff to please come on stage. Professor Sujoy Chakravarti. So we'll start the proceeding with Professor Praveen Jha giving a small gift to Professor Karla Hoff, and then we'll start. May I request Professor Praveen Jha to start the session.
So although we started a little late, but we have made up for at least some of the lost time. So Professor Karla Hoff, it's my privilege to welcome you as the first keynote address speaker. And we really look forward to some serious engagement with the audience after you have spoken. May I request Professor Sujoy Chakravarti to introduce Professor Karla Hoff.
Hello. Will I go up there and do it?
Yes. Your privilege.
Hello, everybody. It's nice to see people. It's a cold morning. So today we have Professor Karla Hoff, Columbia University. And of course, as an experimental and behavioral economist, I'm very, very acquainted with her work, as are students of experimental economics here. And I will quickly give you a brief, something about her background. I don't want to take up too much time because I think her talk is really exciting. So Karla finished her, got degrees from Wellesley College, Fletcher School, and Princeton University. After a while, she taught for a while and then served on the World Bank and ended up as the lead economist of the Development Research Group at the World Bank. Is that correct, Karla? Okay. And she started out as an applied theorist, which a lot of people with from great economists who do behavioral economics now started out working on game theory, discrimination, things like, micro issues. And at some point in the early 2000s, she got interested in running, or maybe it was earlier, Karla, I don't know. I mean, I'm tracking your work. Early 2000s, and she got interested in doing experiments, lab in the field experiments, and there, a certain work that we familiar with her about durable inequalities, that is how stereotypes and stereotype threat affects economic variables, is a very popular template for, I think, discrimination experiments that came after her, including some of my own work. And I feel that her interest in culture and mental models and psychology is really rare to find among economic theorists, and she's quite unique in the field as being a very, very early innovator in getting all of this. When experimental economics was trying to wrap its mind around anomalies, she had already moved on to talking about stereotypes, cultural models, cultural schemas, poverty traps, and general culture variables that economists find uncomfortable to talk about. So she managed to actually weave them in with theory and experiments. And I feel that what she's going to talk about today, I'll leave it to her. But I feel that, as Abhijit Banerjee, another alum of this center has said that, he has said with great finality, economists make horrible predictions. And he says it all the time, horrible, he uses that word. So I feel that, Karla's version 2.0, 3.0 of economic, of the encultured agent, Homo economicus plus will help us kind of get an idea of the real economic agent and allow us to actually model micro behavior in a much more meaningful, sensitive, and rich way over the next few decades. So I leave it to Karla to take you on that journey, at least to open the portal for all of you. Thank you so much. Go ahead, Karla. Come on. Yes, it works. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'll start.
And put it on slideshow.
Yeah, it's on slideshow.
Oh, okay. And then what do I push to advance it?
You have to push this button.
Oh, okay, all I do. And then to
Yeah,
go
just
backwards?
This button. This is no. This is the background.
Okay, okay. So you tell me, so to advance, it's this one. And to go backwards,
This one.
this and this.
This left key and right one.
Okay,
I will be here. If you have any doubt, I will.
okay. Okay, so I'm set. And which is my mic?
Both mics are working.
Okay.
The mic closer, both of them.
Where is Sujoy? Okay. Well, thank you, thank you, Sujoy, for a very kind introduction. I think it was a very accurate introduction in that it explained that what I'm trying to do is expand economics to include the influence of culture on all of us. In the late 19th century and in the 20th century, when modern economics was constructed, the aspiration was to make economics a science like physics. It would be just about natural laws. It would be about universals. It would be a mathematical science. And it's what much of first year microtheory is, and certainly supply and demand are universal laws and have, extraordinary predictive power. But unlike the movement of the stars and nuclear particles, which certainly are governed by universal laws of electromagnetic forces or gravity, the movement of people depends not just on prices and endowments, it also depends on perceptions and cognition and desires. And those things are very much influenced by society and by culture. And all parents know this. All parents worry that their children shouldn't spend too much time with criminal children. And all managers know this. All managers know that if they're not trustworthy towards their employees, the employees won't trust them. And I want to try to persuade you that the 21st century work in experimental economics has shown us that economics can put culture back into economics. Banerjee and Iyer show how the parts of India that in the colonial period were using the landlord-based tax system have such hostility between the landlords and the cultivator classes that they can't cooperate, so they're much poorer because for lack of cooperation, they don't have the infrastructure needed to launch the Green Revolution. And we know that North Italy and South Italy have exactly the same formal institutions, but South Italy, nothing works well and trade is very low, and North Italy is extremely modern and much richer. So I want to move beyond physics envy, which is the first picture, where as late as 1985, Bob Solow could say, economics is the physics of society. There's a single universally valid model of the world. It only needs to be applied to something that is very different. Esther Duflo introduced the idea of the economist as plumber. That is to say, he would or she would take care to assess the effects of whatever intervention she is estimating that are very peculiar and specific. Like the plumber has to look at your particular pipes And your particular clog, it's not some universal, it's not only universals, it's also the peculiar shape of your pipes and your bathroom and your kitchen and how the pipes are related. I want to introduce a third area. We don't want to just look at universal laws, although that's wonderful, and look at problems specific to one place, although of course that's critical. We also want to take into account systematic effects of culture on perception, cognition, and preferences. No one ever mentioned that in my first year of graduate school, but in the 21st century, you have wonderful work by people like Gizo on how psychologically North Indians are just different creatures from South Indians. And you have work on Switzerland, how villages, which a century ago were part of an empire, but the dynasty didn't have an heir, and so they were given the right to have autonomous government. And today those people are much better cooperating, have much higher civic culture. So you see, people, unlike atoms and unlike planets, are shaped by experience. The approach of 20th century economics, which was just on universals, had great achievements. The first fundamental theorem of welfare economics is certainly one of its great achievements. I can still remember learning it. Under idealized conditions, the price system of competitive markets leads to an efficient outcome. It's the invisible hand. We each individually respond to the prices we see. That motivates us, to conserve on really high-priced things. We'll splurge on really low-priced things. We'll try to supply a lot of the high-priced things. And if the price gets too low, we won't supply. So we're all individually responding to these prices. And what Aero de Boer showed is that under idealized conditions, that does produce a wonderful result. That it's Pareto efficient. And that is the first invisible hand. So it's a picture where we're maximizing subject to incentives and endowments. But I want to convince you that cultural cognition acts as another invisible hand. We are all influenced by the norms and the meanings of our culture. In India, we all are very sensitive to caste. When I go to a village, the first question I'm asked by the villagers is, what caste am I? In a society which is highly corrupt, if a person gets a job in the government and does not provide employment to his relatives, then he's shunned because it's viewed as the right thing to do to use government resources to provide private benefits. On the other hand, in the US, at least until very recently, it was considered completely wrong. And even Trump was not able to buy off the people voting, the people working in the polling booths to miscount the votes because they had meanings. Their job was meaningful only to the extent that they followed the rules, and they weren't willing to deviate even under the pressure of people like Giuliani and Trump. So we are all governed not just by prices, but also by the meanings that our society gives, by the categories it gives, by the narratives it gives. We all have ideas that work pays off or only the foolish work. It's a random event whether you get a good job. Or we could be like Trump and say only the foolish pay taxes. Alternatively, we could say, no, bad people cheat, good people pay taxes. So every culture has dominant ideas, and those ideas are very much what norms are embedded in, and whether you believe those ideas or not, you could be punished for violating the norm, and so that is a second invisible hand. And in that invisible hand, you can incorporate very dysfunctional ideas as well as very functional ideas. And what this broadening of economics enables you to do is by taking into account this other invisible hand of meanings, of categories, of narratives, by focusing on them, it broadens the ability of policymakers to promote progress by figuring out how to change them. And I'll give you lots of examples in just a moment. So you do not see the world exactly as it is because you, like me, are bounded. So you categorize everything you see. Some of those categories are natural. You have dogs and cats. If you hear a bark, you immediately see a dog in your head. An American, even a black American, as soon as he sees a black man, he has all kinds of associations, most of them completely false, but they are embedded in our history because in order to justify, legitimize enslaving African Americans, we had to construct an idea that they were an inferior race. And we're having a lot of trouble moving beyond that. And then we have socially constructed ideas. You know, what's fair? Is it fair when you give me a government job that I hire my relatives? Or is it fair that I try to be honest? And of course we have narratives, like the story of Manu, or like the American dream. And all these things we use to construct our perceptions. You are not a camera. When you see me, your subconscious is constructing a person. Not one of you sees my feet, but all of you imagine that I have feet because you have a category that a person has 2 feet. And you've put me in that category and you've constructed me and you construct everything. And I'm now going to give you examples of this invisible hand and how it has real economic consequences. And sometimes it's really low cost, a lot cheaper than the usual tools of policymakers, which are changing incentives or giving transfers. So Globo had a monopoly on TV, and in particular on soap operas, in the 1990s in Brazil. And in the 1990s, there was a lot of political repression. So many of the artists were afraid to write books. They might get in trouble politically. So they were willing to work on soap operas because they thought they wouldn't get into such political hot water. So you had very high quality soap operas. They wanted to make this serious drama, so they didn't have kids. It was adult drama. So all of the female characters had either no children or 1 child. Maybe 1 or 2 had 2, but it was a very, very, very small families. At the same time in Brazil, the average number of kids born by middle-aged women was 5. So everyone starts watching these telenovelas, these soap operas, and seeing women with very few children. And it becomes a role model effect. It changes their preferences. You know, you learn in your first day of graduate school that preferences are exogenous. But of course, every parent knows preferences are shaped by experience. That's why parents work so hard to give their kids good experiences. So people stopped having kids at a younger age. So this is a graph. The dotted lines are just the confidence intervals. The black lines are the actual data. And it's the fertility change relative to the year, called year 0, that Globo transmissions began in a municipality. So hardly any cities had Globo in 1990, but 10 years later, they almost all did. So we can, for each municipality, we can call year 0, let's say 1993, if that's the year he got access to the soap operas. And what you see in this yellow square is that the second a municipality got access to the soap operas, the fertility rate went down. People got the idea that there's life with few children, that life doesn't have to be every year you have another baby. And the effect, of course, was not on educated women. There was no effect on women who had more than an 8th grade education. The effect was for the very poorly, very low educated women, because they'd really never seen communities where women didn't just keep having kids year after year. So it expanded their horizons. And it's clear it was a role model effect. Ileana LaFerrara gives you lots of evidence. I give you just one piece in these slides. She looked at the names you gave your kids, and you started calling your kids the names of the characters in the soap operas. So it's clear that the soap operas were very important to you. And you knew, so the soap opera showed every single weekday night, I think at 8 o'clock, 8 or 9 o'clock, and you knew you'd never call anyone up on the phone at that time because the whole country watched it. 33% of the names of people would be, let's see, how does it go? 33% of the names of the people born after they had Globo were a character in one of the telenovelas. But before the municipality had access to Globo, less than 10%. So the importance of these names tripled, and that can't be an accident. You know, it's year after year you see this. So my second example is somehow the first line is missing. Oh well. The first line is that there was an intervention in Montreal which coached young boys. And this was really a wonderful intervention. This thing was studied for about 35 years. So it's kind of the life, it's really the generation of psychologists that started it and economists that finished it. So what happens? So apparently if you're a kid in kindergarten in Montreal, the teacher evaluates you for aggressiveness, disorderliness, uncooperativeness. And for this experiment, the sample was the most aggressive, uncooperative, difficult boys. And then they were divided between the treatment and the control. The treatment was that in 2nd and 3rd grade, for 1 hour a week, either during lunch or right after school, we would take, let's say Sujoy is the aggressive boy, so I'll take Sujoy and I'll put him in a room with 3 or 4 other boys who are very, very pro-social. And they just play together. They play hide and seek. And there is always a child care worker and a psychologist in the room. And if Sujoy, gets really mad because he's tagged out first and he wants to keep playing, and so he has a fit, the psychologist comes and talks to him and says, when you get really angry, always count to 10 before you do anything. And that'll help you calm down. It'll help you think that, the game is somebody gets tagged out. You're the first one tagged out today. Next time you might could be the last time. It's the game. It's nothing to be angry about. You're all trying to have fun. And the psychologist will tell Sujoy, how to ask why, and how to help, and how to ask for help. So basically, we're helping Sujoy get enculturated in a pro-social world. If he's been identified as a really aggressive kid in kindergarten, it must be that his family, is just too busy to take care of him, or violent, not supportive. So he's just never been enculturated. He doesn't have the concept in his mind of pro-social people. Therefore, he does not act pro-socially. But we get him enculturated by this 1 hour a week program where he's interacting under supervision with very pro-social kids. And then we don't help him anymore. After the 3rd grade, he's on his own. But later we follow him, we get all his records. And do you know what? Sujoy isn't going to have as many repeated grades. And Sujoy is going to be much more likely to graduate from high school. And he's going to make more money. And he's going to stay out of prison. And he's going to get less welfare payments. So I, the government of Montreal, who had to hire, the psychologists and the daycare workers and organize this whole experiment to help Sujoy, to coach him for 2 years, I'm now going to get more tax money. I'm going to pay less in welfare. I'm not going to have to pay to support him in prison. I'm not going to have to pay, to have him repeat grades. I'm going to make money. In fact, Montreal, I'm going to break even on this when he's 20 years old, and I'm going to get an 8% annual return on my investment by the time Sujoy is 39. And if I count his higher income for the $12,000 that I pay per kid on average for this coaching, I'm going to produce $140,000 more. And that's because I took advantage of the fact that this poor kid didn't have the culture he needed to fit into a pro-social world. And if you don't have that culture, nobody wants to hire you. I mean, we all have worked with people who are very distrustful, who are very aggressive, and it's just an incredible headache. If you can't expect a certain level of cooperation, even for things that aren't specifically written down in the contract, it's just very hard to get things done. But you're not going to be a pro-social guy if you don't have the concept of pro-sociality in your head. And you're not going to have that concept unless you've dealt with pro-social people. And most of us have very kind parents. But these kindergartners obviously didn't. And so what was missing, the enculturation, was provided with a big return. So I've told you all this. So now I'm going to do a 3rd example of enculturation. And here it's going to be Superman. So there was a guy, an adult, who was a human rights activist. And he infiltrated the Ku Klux Klan in 1946 and learned all their secrets, all their stupid ways of acting. And he wrote it all down, and he tried to get publishers and newspapers interested. But in 1946, the U.S. was so racist that nobody would take his information. They said, we'll just get into trouble with the government. We don't want to do it. So he went to Kellogg's company, a cereal company, which was the sponsor of a Superman radio serial, a soap opera that was on TV, that was on the radio. And he got them to take his information and produce a whole 16-part radio program, radio soap opera, on the basis of his information. And the radio show was really happy to get this because, you know what? World War II had just ended, and they were running out of villains. They couldn't use the Nazis anymore because World War II was over. We'd won. They needed new villains. So they took his information, and the Ku Klux Klan was going to be the new villain. Now, Superman, as I'm sure you know, was a beloved character famed for fighting for justice. And in each of these 16 episodes, Superman hobbled the racist machinery of the Klan and made fun of its rituals and stripped it of its mystique. Klan membership never recovered. Because, see, people were attracted to the Klan because they thought they'd be tough. But if everyone's making fun of you, then it's no good to join. A Batman comic book picked up the story of one of the episodes in 1950, and I use that just to show you one of the stories. So Batman is standing up for sportsmanship. And this is the story, which I'm sure you can't read, but I'll just read you a few things. So Batman and Robin see that there's a team where there's one black guy and all the others are white guys, and people are trying to push the black guy out, saying he's not a real American. But Superman says on the bottom of the first column, don't believe those crackpot lies about people who worship differently, or those whose skin is of a different color, or whose parents come from another country. Remember our American heritage of freedom and equality. And then at the top of the second column, Batman and Robin are running to save this poor black kid who's being pummeled by the white teammates. And Batman says that it's the one who, it's the one who thinks otherwise, not that people of different color are different, it's the one who recognizes every good teammate is, should be counted as a good member of the team. Those are the real Americans. So if you're prejudiced, you're harming your country. And he concludes, don't weaken our country. A nation divided by prejudice is like a football team without teamwork. So get together, work and play in harmony, and you'll have a successful team. So this was just one of the episodes in the Superman show, and it was very effective. So to generalize these three examples, remember the Brazilian soap operas where it lowers fertility, the coaching of the aggressive kindergartners who then graduate from high school, get higher income jobs, pay more taxes, stay out of prison. And the third example, the Superman serial, all these are cases where your actions, your alpha I, are not just a function of your incentives and endowments, because the Brazilian soap opera, didn't give you a tax for having more kids. It's the mental models that changed. It's the meaning of being black, the meaning of a good life. Doesn't have to be, 15 children. The meaning of being tagged out, the concept of a pro-social guy. All these are categories and ideas and narratives that are part of mental models, and they affect us just like incentives do. They're the other invisible hand. We have the particular thoughts and desires that we do because of the particular society in which we live. If you, with exactly your genetic composition, had been born in a different place, you'd think differently and you'd want different things. But conventional economics abstracts from that. So now I'll give you a nice experiment which isolates completely the effect of cultural mental models on perception. So this was an experiment that was done with Hong Kong University students who were bicultural. They'd grown up in schools where they only spoke English, and they watched lots of American TV and American movies, and yet, they were Chinese. They grew up in Hong Kong. So in an experiment, they're going to be primed either for their Chinese identity or their American identity, or neither. The priming is just showing them pictures. So for the American primes, it's the flag, it's the US Capitol, it's a picture of Abe Lincoln. For Chinese, it's a picture, a beautiful mosaic of a serpent. I'm not quite sure. Okay, it's a pagoda. Okay, this is a temple. And then, I'm not quite sure what this is either. But if you were in this experiment, we'd show you each of these things, and actually there were more, and you'd have to write a couple sentences about what each one meant. This is the flag, this is the serpent, this is the pagoda. You'd have to write a few sentences. And they just wanted to ask you to do that, so you'd really focus on that. And then they show you something completely acultural. You're asked to interpret something, which are fish. So the fish are all close together, but one fish is ahead of the other fish. Why do you think one fish is swimming ahead? Could anyone answer that? There's no right answer. Just why do you think? Could you say that louder? Leadership. Okay, great. Okay, so he's done what I would probably do too, and what certainly the American primed people in Hong Kong did, which is to focus on individual traits. You're an autonomous guy. You have certain features. If you're ahead, it's because you want to be ahead. You have the leadership capacity and desire. But if you were primed for your Chinese identity, you were more likely to say something that was contextual, that picked up the social pressures, that would say, oh, the other fish are chasing the first fish. So the leader isn't autonomous. The leader is in a community, and they are pushing him forward. So there's no right answer. But what's very interesting is even though it was random whether I primed you for your American culture or your Chinese culture, the subjects primed for their American identity perceived a much greater influence, like you, of internal dispositional factors. The first fish might be a leader. And the subjects primed for their Chinese identity offered more explanations based on social relationships, like the other fish might be chasing the first guy. So this is an example where when I prime a particular culture, that culture is not just, the food you eat. Americans tend to think of culture, well, the Italians have spaghetti and the Chinese have sushi. No, it's much deeper. It's the structures in your head that you use to think, because you do not think on the basis of each little photon that hits your eyes. You categorize. You put things in templates, and the templates you have affect how you see the world. If you, like Sujoy in my example, I don't know why I'm picking on him, but he's so nice, he'll forgive me. He didn't have the concept of prosociality. He needed to be coached. Just like the uneducated women in Brazil, they didn't have the concept of stopping to bear children after you've already had 4. So a culture, you could have many cultures. In fact, all of us do. We have a family culture, we have our sports team culture, we have our occupational culture. That culture is a set of mental structures that are like lenses through which we see the world. And just as we see the world differently when we're wearing sunglasses than when we're not, or when we're wearing bifocals and then we're not, we see the world differently when our particular categories associated with a culture come first and foremost to our mind. U.S. culture emphasizes autonomy. Chinese culture emphasizes relationships. So mental models are akin to beliefs. You think there's such a thing as prosociality, or there are good lives for women who have few children. But it's very peculiar properties these beliefs have. They affect how you focus your eyes. They affect how you interpret the fish and everything else. They affect the meanings that you give to things. And even if none of the facts support your mental model, you still might stick with it, because it's kind of part of you. And it could be at a very large cost. So in my not quite finished book, I talk a lot about a book by a sociologist named Ariel Hochschild, who describes these Tea Party supporters in southern Louisiana in an area that's called Cancer Alley. It's called Cancer Alley because everyone is dropping dead of cancer. Even the dogs are dropping dead of cancer. And nobody can swim any longer in the Mississippi, and nobody can eat the fish. The effluents from the chemical companies have poisoned the water and poisoned the dogs and poisoned the people. Do you think they support regulation to close off some of the effluents? No, they don't. they have the idea based on, these are whites, and they have the idea based on a history where, they lost the Civil War, the government took away their slaves, and then in the 1960s, the government forced them to desegregate schools, so they just have a mental model of government as bad. So they can't conceptualize that government laws of controlling affluence would help them. Mental models block their ability to learn. And that's just one example. We all have certain beliefs that are very, very difficult to change, even with facts. And they make it very hard to change society. Not impossible, but just hard. So now in the last part of my talk, I'm going to give you some fun examples, all based on India work, since after all, here we are in India, on how policymakers can change dysfunctional mental models. And the way they change it is not by giving you facts. It's by engaging experience or engaging exposure. So my first example is about caste, and just as background, all of you know this, but I'll just remind you that caste is a big impediment to trade. And that's particularly true with respect to water. And Siobhan Anderson, in a wonderful paper about 13 years ago, compares two types of villages in North India. In one type, all the land, or most of the land, is owned by high caste guys. So they control the groundwater. And most of the cultivators are low caste guys, SCs. In the other type of village, it's not like that. Even the SCs own a lot of land and therefore control a lot of the groundwater. The first set of villages is much poorer than the second set of villages. Why? Because in the villages where the high caste guys control the groundwater, they won't sell it as irrigation water to the cultivators because they have the idea, the mental model, that to sell the water to the low caste guys would pollute the water, would ruin things for everybody. It's not their fault that they believe that. Just like it's not the fault of U.S. Southerners, white Southerners, who to this day do not support health insurance because they see that it would disproportionately help the blacks, and they're just very hostile even to this day to the blacks because after the South lost the Civil War and therefore lost the free labor of the enslaved people, the white people in not all counties, but in the counties where there was a very large proportion of blacks and therefore great dependence on their labor, they worked hard to create the myth that blacks were violent, that blacks were dangerous, that blacks couldn't be trusted. They did that on purpose in order that the blacks wouldn't have outside labor opportunities. Not having outside labor opportunities, they'd still keep working on the plantation at low wages. And that idea, that set of ideas about the blacks from 1865 still holds. So given this background, how are we going to change it? Well, Matt Lowe, for his PhD dissertation, goes to North India and creates cricket teams. He invites people and gets 1,000 volunteers to join a cricket team. And if you win, you even get some money. And anyway, Indians love to play cricket, at least in the villages. So the only condition when you volunteer is that Matt Lowe, the experimenter, gets to decide what team you're on. You don't get to choose what team you're on. But you agree. And so he takes these 1,261 volunteers and he randomly puts them on teams that might be all one caste category, Like they might be all general cast, or they might be all SCs, or they might be half and half. And now for a month, these volunteers are going to play 8 cricket games. And some of them are going to have the experience of collaborating with teammates who are at the very far distant part of the caste hierarchy. You know, high and low would be working together as teammates, but some are not. And what you will find is that this collaborative contact affects their preferences. Oh, and then there's also adversarial contact. So he randomly assigns teams to play games with other teams. So some people would have the experience of a high caste team playing against a low caste team. So that's adversarial contact, because obviously you're interacting, but you're interacting not sharing a goal, but in a very competitive environment. So then he looks at the impact of the experience of either collaboration, a lot of collaboration, or a lot of adversarial contact on your willingness to trade. So it gives to every one of you volunteers, let's say you're all the volunteers, 1,200 volunteers, I'm going to give all of you 2 flip-flops or 2 gloves. But you know what? You're going to get 2 left-handed gloves, or 2 right-handed gloves, or 2 left-handed flip-flops, or 2 right-handed flip-flops. So that's no good, because you don't have 2 left feet. You got to trade. I might have 2 right-handed gloves, and you might have 2 left-handed gloves. So you're going to want to give me one of your gloves in exchange for one of my gloves. But you might be high caste, and I might be SC. God forbid if you should interact with me. But if you've just had 1 month of collaborative experience with a low caste guy, you as a high caste guy, say, yeah, you're willing to deal with me. So the result is, shown in these graphs, the percentage of cross-caste trade is significantly increased for people who played on mixed caste teams compared to people in the control group that didn't have any teams, or in the homogeneous caste teams. So if you compare on the right, the first and the last bar, you can see that just 8 games, you have a significant increase. About 60% of you were willing to do the trade between a high caste guy and a low caste guy, whereas about 50% if you didn't have that collaborative contact. So just, 8 games, and your preferences changed. Now, that doesn't mean these things will stick, because, we've now ended, Ratlow's gone home, the cricket team is disbanded, and you're in a society where the norm is a high caste guy should not interact with a low caste guy. So we don't know how long it will last, but the point is, it's experience that shapes your preferences. And this is graphs which shows how it affects your social interaction. It's very hard to read, but the top graph is the number of other caste that you want to interact with. So high caste, you want to interact with low caste. Low caste, you want to interact with high caste. And the bottom is the number of other caste friends you have. And as you can see, the slope is clearly up if it's collaborative contact you've had, and it's down if you've had adversarial contact. So you see, we are not rational. That is not an insult. That's a feature. Nobody can be angry at me if I say they're not rational. It's like I'm saying the sky is blue. But because you are not rational, you see the world through categories. You have cultural lenses. And seeing the world through categories means everyone you see, you compare to a prototype of that category. You have to simplify. The world is too complicated for you to deal with. So you construct your perception using the prototypes of your category. And your prototype just changed when you had a whole month of playing with the opposite caste. Now your prototype is yeah, I can be on a team with this guy. Or if your experience was adversarial, you say, oh my God, I don't want to deal with this guy. So that means, given that we are enculturated and cognitively bounded, it's really not that hard to change our preferences. So here's one more example. I have a total of 3 of how you can change preferences. So here we want to promote iron-fortified salt consumption in Bihar, where the level of anemia is very high. So in schools, the kids are given fortified salt in their meals. But what about home? Almost half the population is anemic, but information on the value of using iron-fortified salt has no impact. You know, dry facts just don't change your mental models. Even delivering, so in some cases, I delivered the salt for free to a guy's home. He gave it to the cows. Now, is that nice? No, but he didn't have the right mental model. So I made a movie. So this is work by, I've misspelled Bernard here, Banerjee, Barnhart, and Duflo got a movie. So they got real movie stars to make a 30-minute movie where there's Bim, a very skinny, weak guy who has a pregnant wife, and he wants a big, strong son. And a nurse persuades him that if his pregnant wife consumes fortified salt, then the son is more likely to be big and strong. Now, of course, it could be a girl, but he just imagines it's going to be a guy, because that's what he wants. And they show the movie in the intermission between 2 halves of a free showing of a popular film. So they have, you know, like hundreds and hundreds of villages. Half of them are control, half of them are treatment. And in the treatment villages, they have a free movie, invite everyone to the movie, and in the 1.5 hour intermission, they show the movie of Bim. Then a year later, they go to all their people in the sample and ask them, are they using fortified salt? And it's gone up by 5 percentage points. And believe it or not, that's a big deal. Because it was a 30-minute movie, and now it changes what you consume a year later. That's a very big deal, and it's a very low-cost intervention. So a gap of 7 to 16 months between the showing of the movie and the date when the salt consumption is measured, and it increases by about 5 percentage points. And in the paper by Banerjee, Duflo, and Bernard, they say, fortified salt is no longer simply a product that they were told would be good for them. It's the route to fulfilling one of their most important desires, to have a strong son. See, we're not rational. We should want to be healthy and not anemic. But that's not how we think. We think in terms of stories. We want to have a life with a strong son. And the fortified salt will make that story more likely. And then we respond. But obviously, movies, which are watched only by a small proportion of people in the community, cannot change behavior that's governed by norms. There's no norm about what salt you consume. You can consume anything you want. If you don't want to even consume salt, nobody else cares. But there's a lot of behaviors where people do care. And then it's very much more challenging to figure out how to change the mental model, because I can't do it one by one. I have to do the whole community. And so that's like why it is that that intervention on caste with a cricket team might, a year later, have a 0 effect. Because the people get back into their culture, they're not in their cricket team, and people might shun them if they interact too much with the high caste if they're low caste, or low caste if they're high caste. So sometimes you want to change the whole community. So an intervention that helps you change the whole community is called participatory theater. One version that's well known is called Theater of the Oppressed. It was invented in Brazil, and it shows a very short, stark drama based on things that everybody's experienced in their own community. And then after showing this short drama, a guy who's called the Joker stands up and says, now we're going to do the play all over again. But any one of you who is in the audience can yell stop at any point. Come on stage, say at what point they want to restart the drama, and then they can respond in such a way to try to avert the violence or avert the bad ending. And then the actors have to respond. And so they basically practice social change. And the actors are all trained to make it very difficult. Not because they want to stop change, but because they want to give the individual the experience of how hard change is. So you get to practice. And the performance of the simple drama could be just, half an hour. And then for 2 hours, it's replayed and replayed and replayed. And many of you can go on stage one at a time and take up the role of one person. If you take my role, I'll take off my shirt and you'll put on my costume. You'll be me. And then you'll try to see how to avert the bad ending. So a organization called Jana Sanskriti, which is well known around the world and performs around the world, but created local-based teams in villages in West Bengal. They do dramas written by a brilliant dramaturge named Sanjoy Ganguly, and one of the big themes is domestic violence and alcohol abuse. And so here you're seeing on stage, anyone can go, like street theater, it's just performed in public, anyone can go. And you're seeing wife beating, and after this, when the drama is ended, then someone will come on stage called the Joker and say, we're going to start over, and anyone can stand up and go on stage and take the part of one of the characters and see how to change the story to avert the violence. And it helps individuals take an outsider's perspective on their own behavior. I mean, suppose you're always late. So suppose people are always having to wait for you. And you don't really think about it. You just think about how you're so busy and you need to get all these things done. But now you see a play where you see the guys who are waiting for you and how you're ruining their dinner party because you're not there. So you get to see, as an outsider, the whole picture, which none of us, in normal life gets to see. And so, there are guys that Sanjoy Ganguly in his books quote saying, I never thought about the suffering of my wife, but now I'll never hit her again. Now that doesn't mean he really won't hit her again, but it means that at least for the moment, he realizes there's another perspective, there's another person out there. And so you can get a new prototype and a new representation, a new mental model. A real man is not someone who beats his wife, and a good wife is not someone who bows to the will of her husband. No, she has a voice. So Jyotsna Jalan and I in Shatwik Santra have tried to evaluate the impact of Jana Sanskriti, and in unpublished work we find very tentatively that the proportion of husbands who think domestic violence is legitimate, if they have not been in a village exposed to this participatory theater, is about 22%, and that's cut in half when the village is exposed. It changed the mental model. And in the same way, it changed the incidence, the proportion of wives who actually have been beaten. So to conclude, 4 more slides. What we're trying to do by introducing this obvious omitted variable in economics, namely mental models that come from culture, that you have to use because you're bounded. And again, that's not an insult. That's a feature. If you didn't have mental models, it would take you 3 hours to get out of bed in the morning. You'd have to think, well, who are you? What are you going to do? Which side of the bed? Whereas none of us think like that. We all have habits. We all have prototypes. We all have identities. and that tells us what we're going to do. So there are many more, so this perspective, this new understanding of what drives our behavior that brings in not just incentives and endowments, but also mental models, unfortunately gives us cognitive path dependence. Because whereas I can change a price just like that in an instant, I can impose a tax or create a subsidy. I can't change your mental model instantly. Not even the cricket team instantly. And so history becomes, history's inside your brain. Society's inside your brain. That's why it is that U.S. Southerners, U.S. Southern whites are just different creatures from people who aren't from the South, because they've absorbed their history of legitimizing slavery. So that means society can be rigid. Institutions determine your experiences. If you're in India, maybe high-caste guys in a village aren't supposed to interact with low-caste guys. That shapes your mental models, which shapes your behavior, and it could replicate the institutions. So we can explain societal rigidity, whereas neoclassical economics cannot. Neoclassical economics, you're a rational actor. You don't have culture. So a paper by Guizzo, which is focused on North Italy, is about long-run persistence. And it shows the persistence of, believe it or not, a medieval experience as a city-state. So we're talking about 100 years, 1300 to 1400, your municipality was a city-state. That's going to affect how your regional government works today. The neoclassical model is a special case. It pretends to be the general case. It wants to be the general case. And of course, physics is the general case. Everyone is subject to the same gravitational forces. I can lose weight if I go to Pluto. We all can lose weight if we go to Pluto. But we all don't see caste the same way. We all don't see domestic violence the same way. We all don't see corruption the same way. And I can't say that the way you see it is wrong and the way I see it is right. We all see it based on our mental models, which are largely subconscious. So in the conventional model, we're rational actors, and we just do what makes sense for us, given our preferences and our constraints. But I want to add in two more factors: the mental models we have and the context that activates them. Now, of course, some mental models are always activated. In a village in North India, caste is always activated. But as we saw from the experiment with the Chinese bicultural guys, whether they saw things through an American lens or a Chinese lens depended upon how they'd been primed. So we have two more variables. And the conventional model leaves them out because it treats your preferences as exogenous and your capacity to reason as unbounded. So that's the special case. Well, what's the alternative? What are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to just give up? No, of course not. We don't believe for a moment that some generic model with mental models as a variable is useful, because there's really no limits on what they could believe. Rather, what we want is simply to acknowledge that we are enculturated people, that we have mental models, and that there are equilibria of mental models, just like there are equilibria of prices. And recognize that all this recent work, and I just cited a few papers, like Palak and Green, on the impact of a soap opera in Rwanda, where it was kind of a Romeo and Juliet soap opera, but it made people more accommodating, more willing, Hutus and Tutsis, to cooperate after a horrible experience where Hutus basically went next door and murdered their Tutsi neighbors. Then Nunn and Wanchakan, in a study that looks at, it's very sad, the legacy of the slave trade in African countries, from which a very large number of slaves were exported is that nobody trusts anybody. You don't even trust your own family. Why not? Because 150 years ago, in the slave trade, people would sell their own family members into slavery because the only way to protect yourself from being enslaved was to get a gun. The only way to get a gun was to get money. The only way to get money was to sell someone into slavery. So the institutions of Africa were destroyed where the slave trade was very large. So that's None and Wanchakan. La Ferrara, of course, is the Globo. Gizo is North versus South Italy. Jasheo is a wonderful paper where they do an experiment where they get the Arabs and Israelis in Israel to trade on the stock market. They give them money to trade on the stock market. And they learn by trading, I think it lasts about 6 weeks, that when there's higher risk of war, all the stocks go down in value. All the local stocks go down in value. Because obviously, if your country's going to be destroyed, your stock isn't worth very much. So they become much more sensitized to the cost of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And then it increases the number of people who vote for pro-peace parties. It changes their preferences. It changes how they see the world. Just like when I watched BIM, it changed how I thought about fortified salt. Or when I watched domestic violence and participatory theater, it changed. Now I saw, when I hit my wife, maybe she really suffers. So because we're bounded, you can change our focus. So policymakers have many more tools than they had before, just by recognizing that we are enculturated people. So here's my last slide. I call this set of mental models the other invisible hand because we're all affected by it, even though we are acting individually. Just like we're all affected by prices, even though individually we decide how much bread to buy, how much butter to buy, and how much labor to sell. So these cultural representations and meaning systems that emerge from each in our individual behavior, if we're all corrupt, then corruption will be normalized and we'll think it's good. If we're all honest, then we'll think corruption is bad. It's we who create this, just like we providing demand or supply of a good influence the prices. So this is another way in which society is controlled. But unfortunately, whereas the price system has absolutely wonderful efficiency properties, there's no presumption that your mental models have any good properties. Maybe they're great, maybe they keep all of you honest and hardworking, but maybe they don't. Depends what your history is. And of course, there are subcultures within any community. When I had the example with Sujoy, as the very aggressive guy in kindergarten, he had to be enculturated with pro-social people. So it's not just the Indian culture and the Chinese culture, it's, all kinds of subcultures within them. But harmful mental models can be overcome. And as I showed you with the Montreal experiment, the rate of return on those interventions can be a very big deal. Giving good experiences gives us new prototypes. When Mohammed Salah joined the Liverpool team, hate crimes against Muslims in the Liverpool area plummeted because now people thought Muslims are great. And it was just one guy who certainly isn't representative. All Muslims are not great soccer players, but we're not rational, so one prototype can change the category. So the 21st century empirical and experimental work enables us to put Bob Solo's famous quip aside. He said, quote, attempts to explain why some countries grow more slowly than others always end up in a blaze of amateur sociology. We can go beyond that now. And I hope all of you will. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have a little time for questions. I'm sure this was quite thought-provoking, so any of you have any questions, and you can go ahead. Do we have a mic?
Yeah.
Okay, so just get the mic and ask the
Wonderful, sir.
question.
It would also be good if you introduce yourself for the benefit of everyone.
Yeah, I'm Shurajit Das. I teach in Center for Economic Studies and Planning, JNU. First of all, we are immensely grateful to Karla for coming all the way from New York to New Delhi only for this conference. And also thank you for this fascinating lecture. My question is, in the discipline of economics, these important aspects of behavioral and cultural aspects of our society have been, I would say, neglected for quite a long period of time. And of late, in the heterodox school, of course, there are some interesting work happening. But as far as the theory of microeconomics and macroeconomics is concerned, I think it is still largely insensitive to these behavioral and socio-cultural aspects. Now, is it because of inconvenience of bringing them into our formal modeling, or is it because of, or is it just an intentional mistake, or is it political?
So this is a multiple choice. That's good. Do you hear me? So this is a multiple choice test. I think my options are, is it inconvenient? Is it political? Is this good?
Closer to the mic, yeah, so that.
Is it inconvenient? Is it political? What are my other options? Unintentional. Okay. Well, it's different for different economists. Certainly there are some economists for whom the mental model of economics is physics. And just like if your mental model is you're high caste and you can't interact with a low caste guy, even though you would gain by trading with a low caste guy, I mean, Siobhan Anderson shows that the whole village is impoverished if the water is controlled by the high caste guys and the cultivators are the low caste guy. Everybody is hurt. But you have to preserve your identity. So if your identity is that economics is physics, then you're just not going to go this way. And you're just going to say, well, that's the exception, but it's just not going to influence me. You know, you're going to talk about how wonderful the Arrow-Dubois theorem is and how economics as physics has so much to contribute, and you're going to ignore it. What's very interesting is so option one, you know, it's just not acceptable, is picked by some people, and Dubois is one of those people. Arrow is kind of the opposite. Arrow was always saying we should put more sociology into economics, and in particular into behavioral economics. I mean, to the day he died, he was saying that. And Arrow all the time was saying, you know, of course he's very proud of his work on the fundamental theorems, but he was always saying, this proves that the economy is not efficient because these conditions that have to be met for the fundamental theorems to hold can never be met. So whereas Dubois viewed this as somehow characteristic of the real world, Arrow always emphasized it wasn't. Arrow emphasized that it couldn't be. When I cough, all of you know, have risk of getting whatever dread disease I have, and I assure you, you're not paying me not to cough, and I'm not paying to compensate you for the fact that I might be spreading a disease. So anyway, some people would say it's just unacceptable, and some people would say, no, we really should do this, but it's very hard to do. is just very, very hard to do. And the people whose work I've cited, like La Ferrara's work on Globo, or like Nunn's work on the slave trade, or Guizot's work, they never use the word mental model. They do not have that concept, just like, poor Sue Joy in my example didn't have the concept of a pro-social guy. And, an example, I wouldn't say this if Sendel Melanothan were in the room, but even though Sendel is a genius, I think he did make a mistake in a paper which is called Thinking, Fast and Slow, ? This is a paper where he's basically enculturating a very aggressive, uncontrollable guys, whether in high school or in juvenile prison, to be more cooperative, to recognize that it's fine to be tough when you're in a lawless environment, but when you're in a school or a workplace and someone says, please sit down, I'd like to start class, you should please sit down and be quiet. You should, be aggressive towards the teacher as if she's threatening your manhood. So this is a paper all about giving kids a new mental model. Yet they don't see it. They think this paper is about getting people to think slow. You're not going to think slow for 3 years. I could give you $1 billion and I wouldn't get you to think slow for 3 years because human beings simply aren't capable of that. So these guys really learned a new mental model, and then they recognized there are some environments in which I should be cooperative and some environments in which I should be really tough. But he got it wrong because he didn't have the concept. Just like Sue Joy, in my kindergarten example, he didn't have the concept of prosociality. So it's very hard for economics to change because it has the mental model of being like physics. In fact, one piece of evidence that we're irrational is that really brilliant economists can't accept this because they're so married to the mental model of physics. But I think that there is so much exciting work now which is producing hard data, which economists do accept, on the impact of, say, movies. Elise and AER had 2 papers on the impact of a movie called Birth of a Nation and how it basically revived the KKK. So I think as we have more evidence of the power of narratives, the power of participatory theater, the power of giving people new experiences like the mixed cast teams, then we will broaden economics and we will recognize the category of mental models.
Okay, one more, or 2 more, okay? Here and then at the end. First here. Yes.
Good morning, ma'am. Firstly, I'd like to thank you for the wonderful talk. It was eye-opening for everyone here, I'm sure. And my name is Avikant. I'm a student of CESP. I'm doing my master's right now. So my question was, some things are more personal to us than others. So, for example, in India, our religious and caste identity is very close. So is there a hierarchy of such things within our mental models? And how can experiments or targeted interventions account for this? So, for example, if an experiment unintentionally offends someone about something that they hold really personally, they might be less likely to listen or to change their behavior. So how do we account for this nuance? And thank you.
Both questions are excellent questions. The first question is easy. The second question is hard. The first question is there a hierarchy of mental models? Absolutely. Mental models differ in their accessibility. Some are very, very inaccessible. You have the concept, but you just hardly ever think of it. And some are chronically available. So, for an Indian, to use your example, religion and caste would be chronically available. So for sure there is that. And one of the ways in which interventions can change a person is simply by making a not very accessible mental model more accessible. So that was your first question. Your second question was something about insulting people. They won't listen to you because you've already offended them. And that is certainly a very, very big issue. It's incredibly easy to offend people, without you having any concept, much less an intention of doing it, which is why it is so important to be like the plumber, or like, there are three levels: the universal, then there's the very specific, your particular pipe, the plumbing, and then there's culture in between. It's very important to be sensitive to these two lower levels when you're designing an intervention, because if you get it wrong, even though you've copied an intervention that worked perfectly in one place, it's going to be a failure in the other place. So once you recognize that people are acting not as rational actors, but as enculturated actors, as a function not just of incentives as endowment, but also as a function of their mental models and the context that activates particular mental models, you have a clue on what to look for to design an intervention. And so, as Esther would say, you have to do a lot of pilots so you can figure out how to not insult people.
Thank you. Yes, last one.
Very insightful talk, ma'am. My name is Deepak. I am an ex-student of CESP and currently working at Pratham Education Foundation. So in India, most of the disadvantaged children are studying in government schools. And the children in government schools have low learning levels. So basically in government schools, both parents and teachers have poor opinions of each other. Basically there is a culture of blame. So parents think that the teachers are not teaching, and teachers think that the parents are not helping children at home. So there is a culture of blame. So is it that how can we change this culture, or we can nudge this culture so that we can have an effective community school relationships so that they share responsibility instead of blaming each other? Thank you.
That's an extremely interesting question. And it's certainly something I've seen. I've spent time in village government schools, and I've seen the teachers hit students really for no good reason. There is a hostility between the teachers and especially the low-caste students. And certainly it's easy for the teachers to blame the parents, and easy for the parents to blame the teachers. And yet I've also seen schools in village India which were just absolutely extraordinarily well run. Everyone would come on time, and then they'd, sing some patriotic song, and then they'd sit down and their teachers would all be present. And it just shows how important culture is. These schools are functioning in the same formal environment, and yet a headmaster can create a culture in which the teachers are kind to their students and the students are cooperative. So how to do that? That's your question, and that is a hard question. I think that leadership is obviously very important, and prototypes are very important. To bring in one or two star teachers who will set the example, I think, and change the prototype of what a teacher is, and raise the expectations of parents would be very, very important. Unfortunately, there can be a village culture that makes this hard. A study that was done by Priyanka Pandey and her brother Sandeep Pandey, who lives in India and is an activist, looked at the impact of reservations for SCs as pradhans in villages in North India, and found I mean, this is a paper in Economic and Political Weekly, that if the Pradhan was SC, the teachers who were generally high caste and the students who were generally low caste got a much worse deal. The teachers were much more likely to be absent. The teachers were much more likely to be sleeping during the school day. Priyanka visited 11 times over 2 years at random the schools and just jotted down what was happening. And then she gave tests based on what's supposed to be learned in the first week of school to the fourth graders. And again, in the villages where there were SC Pradhans, the kids learned much less. They were much less likely to get the right answers. So there's this culture where I guess the high caste people felt very angry that the SC was low caste, and they had to resist and somehow punish the low caste children. So change is extremely difficult, but I think examples are really, really powerful, particularly examples of individuals who are admired. So if you can get somebody who's admired, like Mohammed Salah, he can change how all Muslims are treated. Get these teachers on mixed chaos soccer teams. Get these teachers to watch participatory theater, to look at things from the point of view of the SC kid. Get everyone to understand that if the SCs get educated, I mean, they're 20% of the population, then India will be richer and everyone's better off. Get people to change their identity. I haven't given you an answer, but I think touched on areas that bear on what the answer is.
Okay, so after this wonderful painting of this critical canvas, may I now request Sujay, who was so much at the attention of the talk, to propose a vote of thanks to Karla.
Very unaggressively, I will propose that the vote of thanks. So Karla, really, really thank you so much. I think this talk has definitely benefited me. I've learned about a lot of studies that I didn't know about, experimental study, and those of you here, I hope you got benefited. I see some of my students here. I hope it's a good experience getting the real thing, down here. So I'm very, very happy. Thank you so much, Karla. And more questions, I guess you'll be getting a whole barrage of them outside, and maybe you can have a cup of tea and move on to the technical sessions. Thank you again for taking the time to come and visit us. Thanks.